Hey folks,
Matt.
as you start to join ACF's COP26 Glasgow live panel, joined by a team both in Australia and in Glasgow in the action room at the main conference centre for the UN Climate Change Conference. So I might get our panellists to introduce themselves, starting with perhaps you, Suzanne, here in Australia, and then we'll throw to the team in Scotland.
Great, thanks, Matt. Hello, everyone. I'm Suzanne Harder. I'm a climate change and clean energy campaigner at the ACF and tracking the COP from Australia.
Thanks, Suzanne. What she forgot to mention is that she's an absolute legend when it comes to policy. I'm Freya. I'm the Media and Investigations Manager, and I work with everyone on this team, but Suzanne and Gav are definitely the policy experts, so I'll throw over to Gav.
Yes, and I'm Gavin McFadgen. Hi, everybody. I run the climate change campaign at the Australian Conservation Foundation.
With all the formalities out of the way, we might jump straight into it. And Gav, obviously, you are there on the ground in Glasgow. Can you tell us about the first few days that have seen all the world leaders who are going to attend this conference attend and make their statements, make their pledges, and a little bit of an assessment of what's happened so far?
Well, it's really been an extraordinary first week. I think what we saw was that the leaders first, obviously, in the G20, as many people would know, and the G20 didn't really provide the shot in the arm that many world leaders wanted. So when they arrived in Glasgow, we saw a flurry of announcements, because these meetings are really about momentum, creating early momentum, because once a few countries move, you often see an avalanche of announcements. So in the first couple of days with the Leaders Summit, we saw Boris Johnson and Joe Biden make a whole suite of big announcements with regards to methane, with regards to fossil fuel transition and exit, phasing out of finance for overseas fossil fuels, and so forth. And after the first 2 days now, we kind of get more into the policy wonky part of the meeting. We'll start to see draft text for various parts of the agreement. But what's been pleasing to see, I think, just in the last 24 hours is a significant increase in momentum and optimism at this meeting. In particular, the methane pledge, so 103 countries signing up to reduce methane by 30% by 2030. And just in the last few hours, really, has been this major coal announcement, 190 countries agreeing to a coal phase out and no new coal projects, including some countries that we haven't seen much movement on before, Poland, Vietnam, Egypt, Chile and so forth, heavily dependent on coal now agreeing to that phase out. That's making Australia look like an outlier now. We're not signing up to these coal phase out agreements. And we know coal is key. It's the biggest source of emissions. We need to get it out of our energy system. And once we do that, we can more easily reduce emissions from things like transport. So once you get major announcements on coal, that's where you get movement in emissions reduction in countries across the world. So that phase out is 2030 for rich countries, 2040 for poorer countries. As I said, and it's backed in by the investment community around the world, agreeing for no new overseas investment from the end of, well, hopefully from the end of this year, perhaps into next year. So some real momentum just in the last 24 hours.
And so I guess, Suzanne, you're here on the ground in Australia. What's been the assessment from the Australian Conservation Foundation of Australia's activity overseas this week?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. You know, it would be hard to interpret Australia's actions there as anything but really acting as a bit of a barrier to action and going to COP not only with empty hands. Our government would make the case that a net zero announcement was a significant announcement, but in reality, this COP is really about ambition, and it's about near-term ambition. So a net zero commitment was important. It was an important target to have out there in the future, but it needed to be combined with some commitments for near-term action, in particular a 2030 target that's much stronger than what we have right now. Our current target is in line with about 3 degrees of global warming, and we all know that is a catastrophic amount of global warming. So we really needed to see an increase there. Australia also went with our government's hands well in their pockets, but not pulling anything out on finance. And climate finance is a really important part of the Paris Agreement. The developing world that signed up, they obviously signed up with a different level of responsibility in terms of how they reduce emissions. And that requires assistance from countries that have developed off the back of fossil fuels and have got rich off of them. We did see our government increase our finance commitment, but certainly not enough and not in line with what was expected. So on a number of levels, I would say the most important one, though, is a reflection on what Gav just mentioned about this really important global commitment, really big commitment to end fossil fuel finance and start phasing it out of domestic use. And instead of doing that, the Australian government hasn't signed on to that, but more importantly, they went to the COP actually spruiking Australia as a good place to invest in fossil fuels, lining up with gas companies about using carbon capture and storage to prolong the use of fossil fuels and other things. So I would say really bad marks in the whole fossil fuel spectrum, and certainly very low ambition.
I think the thing you mentioned right at the end there, Suzanne, was about the spruiking of Australia being a great place to invest in fossil fuels and fossil fuel projects. And I reckon, Freya, you're probably best placed to talk to this because we did have a few chats about it over the last couple of days. And that is the presence of, at the Australia marquee, a particularly prominent display from an Australian company. Do you want to tell us about that and how that was received?
Yeah, so I suppose as media and investigations manager at ACF, I'm looking for all the quirky, strange things happening here at COP26 to relay back to you. And on the first day, a monstrosity of a model was wheeled in on four wheels. It was huge, and it was a huge Santos CCS carbon capture and storage model. And it was so big it didn't actually fit in the right spot at the Australian pavilion. So to give you a bit of a background, a lot of countries have these individual pavilions, and ours, it wasn't sponsored by Santos, but Santos branding is everywhere there. So that has certainly gained a lot of media attraction. It's a fossil fuel company at a climate conference. And furthermore to that, there has been no engagement whatsoever with the environment NGOs or First Nations people in that pavilion space. So I don't know if I answered your question, Matt, but that's something that's certainly been picked up in the media domestically.
I might throw to thanks, Freya. I might throw again to both of you over there in Glasgow, a question from one of our audience members. So Vanessa Blyer has asked, is there anything positive that Australia has done so far to combat climate change at this COP26 in Glasgow?
I would actually say not a lot. I mean, the finance commitment was good. An extra 500 million, bringing Australia's commitment up to 2 billion. 50% for mitigation, 50% for adaptation. So that's to reduce emissions firstly, and then to help poor countries adapt to the climate change that's already happening. That's a good commitment, but it's no replacement for reducing emissions. You can't give poor countries money to help them adapt and reduce climate change when you're not getting your own emissions down. If you were to ask poor countries what would they prefer, they would prefer Australia to be more ambitious to get our emissions down so that they're not feeling the impacts of the climate change that is happening now and that is in the pipeline. We really did hope that on the back of the 2050 announcement, that Australia would bring a stronger diplomatic presence and a high level of ambition, but it has continued to be a blocker, really, when it comes to not signing the methane pledge, not getting on deck with commitments to reduce coal, not bringing a stronger 2030 commitment for emissions reduction, at least doubling that commitment, as Suzanne mentioned. Australia's performance hasn't been good enough and needs to really improve in the next week.
If we want something slightly positive, I suppose it's a deforestation. We did sign up to the deforestation pledge. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because certainly as a conservation foundation, that's important. we always think it could be better, but it is a good start.
It's a good signal. I think the devil in the detail is going to be there with Australia. Sorry to be cynical, but logging and land clearing are really the domains of state governments in Australia. So in terms of our own domestic nature policies, we need a stronger EPBC Act, we need stronger national environment laws, and we need to rapidly get land clearing down, especially in Queensland and New South Wales, and logging in Victoria and Tasmania especially. So it's a good signal, but as with a lot of these announcements, the pledges are big, the headlines are big, but we need to see Australia bring sincerity to the commitments it makes in the next week or so.
Yeah, and certainly at the start, I think we've touched on it a little bit. Australia, with Scott Morrison's speech, certainly set a tone that we are the weakest link among developed countries. And because Australia didn't set a stronger 2030 target, it makes it really hard for countries like the UK, the host country, and the US to get other countries to do more this decade. If countries like wealthy countries like Australia aren't even going to bother bringing up ambitions. So really sorry to not bring anything that positive, but yeah.
I mean, the positivity is in that the world is moving. There's really clear global momentum out of the EU, out of the Biden presidency and America's leadership. Even seeing countries like China, South Korea and Japan make bigger financial pledges, make coal phase out pledges. India made a net zero by 2070 commitment. That looks a long way out, but that's a big commitment from a developing country, when developing countries are sitting back and waiting to see what the rich countries do, both with regards to finance and emissions reduction. So what's been pleasing to see is that the world's moving.
Yeah.
And the pressure will only build at this COP and then in the months leading up to the federal election for Australia to lift its game.
And I think I read late last night that with the increased targets that have been announced here at COP26 from various countries, it will help to limit global temperatures. I believe it was 1.9. I do need to do a bit of a fact check to that, but basically the increased targets that countries are coming to, not Australia, but other countries, it is putting us on the right pathway to limit global temperatures below 2 degrees.
I think one of the points that was very briefly raised there was by you, Gab, around how forestry, for instance, is a state-based responsibility. And Suzanne, I might throw to you about this, because one of the comments that came out from some of the observers high up in the UN body there is that Australia hasn't really made any new commitments. And their pledge to sort of hit that 36% reduction mark by 2030 is actually born out of state policy. So what would actually make the difference in terms of the federal government making a commitment in that sense?
You're starting to break up there a bit, mate.
Sorry, that's a good question, Matt. So ACF commissioned a bit of work on this issue as well, and looking at projected emissions reduction. And what it showed is that we could in fact exceed our current targets, but that's not because of any action the federal government is taking. It was because we do have some strong state and territory actions in place, particularly around transitioning to renewable energy, and also some good transport policies. So the states are moving, but we still need those national policy settings from the federal government to help make that action more coordinated, consistent, have targets around it. So we still really need to see some strong climate and energy policy and some direction from the federal government. And while it's true, Australia did sign up to the forest agreement, and it's important that we did. But as Gav mentioned, the devil is really in the detail. But we're still a global hotspot for deforestation and biodiversity loss. So we really do need to see our EPBC Act strengthened, so our environmental laws strengthened to protect trees, protect biodiversity, and protect land. A quarter of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions come from the land sector, and so deforestation is really playing still quite a big part to the problem here. So again, we just need some very strong national, federal policy settings, and not just in the energy sector, but actually across the whole economy, because what we're not seeing at all are policies to reduce emissions for industry or for transport or for a lot of the sectors And instead, they're riding off the back of, again, state action and the fact that renewable energy is becoming very cheap. It's the cheapest new energy source. And so we are seeing some transition there, but again, really not because of the federal government.
Thanks, Suzanne. That's a really good insight into the policy needs for the country. I'm going to throw back to Gav and Freya in Glasgow, and hopefully you guys can get this okay, because I think you might have broken up a little bit.
I think you're back.
I think we're back.
Cool.
Are we back? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it sounds good to me. So Sally from our audience has asked, has there been much discussion on carbon tariffs and taxes at an international level? And I guess for both of you, this is something that's been talked about recently, and that is if Australia drags its feet on climate action, will it be penalised anyway through taxes and tariffs imposed by global trading partners?
Not a lot of discussion so far, but as we know, that is at one level a threat hanging over Australia's performance. Australia is in free trade negotiations with the EU. They've been stalled, partly because of climate action and partly because of our withdrawal from the French subsidy. So there'll be close scrutiny on Australia and lifting its climate performance, or it will suffer some trade restrictions into the EU, and it may not stop there. There's also growing talk of a stronger global emissions trading scheme with greater consistency, stronger legality and governance, and so that's one to watch as well. So what you're seeing there is Australia's the number one coal and gas exporter in the world, and we're increasingly selling those high emissions fuels into countries that are lifting their ambition. And that means that the days of Australian fossil fuel exports are numbered, which is why recently Australia did a joint report with the BCA and the ACTU to look at how to transition our fossil fuel exports towards hydrogen and green steel and direct renewable energy exports, so that we don't suffer the trade restrictions, tariffs and other penalties that might come our way unless we decarbonise our exports of fossil fuels around the world.
And Sally, if you're still listening to this Facebook Live, we can certainly, now that we know there's some interest in that, keep our eyes and ears to the ground and try to get some more information. Today's focus is certainly on energy, so it may very well come up today. And we'll put any of those details into the People's Pass, which is a newsletter that we've created for you. So all of those details will be on our Facebook page and Instagram page. But it's really great to get questions like that, because we can now keep an eye and ear out. And if we're talking to, for example, the EU delegation at some point, or even go and head over to one of the major EU pavilions, then we could start to talk to them about that as well.
I should say thanks to you for mentioning the People's Pass, Freya, and I'll take the opportunity to mention to folks that if you are watching on desktop or mobile, you should see a live tab in your feed, allowing you to go through to the ACF website and subscribe to the COP26 People's Pass, which goes out semi-regularly with reports from Freya and Gav on the ground in Glasgow, as well as analysis from key people here at ACF in Australia, including CEO Kelly O'Shannessy. I've got another question from our audience. So this one is from Astas Tiofia. Are Australian businesses, in particular mining, taking action in stopping the use of exporting coal? It's probably a difficult question in some ways to answer, because how can we know what specific businesses are planning for? But Gav and Suzanne, is there any legislation potentially on the horizon from this government that could assist with limiting coal exports coming out of Australia at this time or going forward?
No, not really. I mean, we've seen new coal approvals across New South Wales and Queensland just in the last couple of months, and several in the pipeline. It does seem to be slowing. The coal industry in Australia seems to be prioritising the expansion of existing mines rather than new projects. But as people would know, even the Adani mine is close to giving out its first tonnes of coal. So this is where Australia is really starting to fall behind where the rest of the world is heading. So we're not seeing. In fact, it's the biggest thing we're not seeing in some ways is that the Australian government and state governments aren't taking stronger action to transition away from coal, both for our domestic transition and in particular for exports.
Is the mood hopeful? Oh, sorry, Suzanne, you came off mute. I'll let you go.
Oh, Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'll just add to that. That's exactly right, what Gav just said. But to add to that, in the face of the COP26 and the methane agreement, just today, it's reported that the government has opened up a whole lot of new acreage for potential new gas exploration licenses. So while everyone's phasing out coal, but also gas, this is also part of the phase out that's being driven through COP. We're actually expanding our gas exploration and development here in Australia, absolutely against the grain of what needs to occur.
Another one for the Glasgow team is from Linny Robertson. Guys, do you think, is the mood hopeful there? That's probably the key point that Linny would like to know. What's the sentiment that you're experiencing over in Glasgow?
Hey, Linny, thank you for that question. We will always remain hopeful as two people from the Australian Conservation Foundation. The wider mood, what do you reckon, Gav?
As I said before, I mean, this is my fourth COP. This is the most optimistic I've seen a global meeting since Paris, and it's focused. It's focused on the task at hand. People know they can't leave Glasgow next week without an agreement. No one goes home until there's an agreement. I think that's fairly and squarely on world leaders, and despite Australia's performance, I'm actually the most optimistic now than I've been in quite a while. I'm seeing a lot of momentum. I'm seeing the Leaders Summit front-ended, not back-ended in this conference. I think it was a good idea off the back of the G20. That really gave negotiators a strong mandate to make strong commitments in the next week. As Freya said, we're very close to getting global pledges at about the 2-degree mark. We've never been that close. Like, we've never been remotely close to that. So look, there's still a lot of work to do, but I'm actually very upbeat about how these negotiations are going now. I think the next couple of days will be critical in terms of turning those pledges into draft text of an agreement, assessing that text, and then we'll be able to get back to people with more of the detail behind some of the big announcements that have been made.
So there's lots to be hopeful for. I think as well, just to add though, Australia is an outlier here, and so that doesn't fill me with a lot of hope. And I think certainly having Scott Morrison fly in and out, and Energy Minister Angus Taylor is only here until the end of the week. They're not there with the rest of the world's hope here at COP26. So we have a lot of work to do as Australians to put pressure on our elected representatives to play catch up with what's being agreed here at COP26. And that's why it's so important that we're here to find out exactly what's going on and what countries are signing up to what. So when we come back home, we can say to our elected MPs that it's not good enough because France, the UK, the US, they're all signing up to these really ambitious targets, really ambitious pledges, and Australia should too.
And just finally, of course, we've got a bit of a unique opportunity in that within 5 months or so of this COP, we have a federal election. So there's never been a better time to put pressure on our politicians. This is the Labor Party, this is the alternate government as well, so the Morrison government and the Albanese opposition, to really pressure them to lift their game, to say that Australia really needs to improve its position on climate in terms of the policy offering that both of the major parties take to the next election.
I might throw a follow-up to that point you've made about the response to Australia, because we've got a few questions coming through from Judy Seaton, from Josh Williams, about the sentiment towards Australia itself. And Freya, I know that you've been speaking particularly to people from civil society organisations and delegates from nations around the world. What's the general feeling towards Australia and to our leadership on the ground there in Glasgow?
Yeah, so an example I'd really like to use is that the Australian Pavilion is right next door to a pavilion aimed at reducing methane. So that sets a real tone, given Australia isn't signing up to the methane pledge, that we're really behind. Certainly among civil society, we're feeling on the outer in terms of meeting up with the Australian delegation. We haven't been invited to any events or any meetings. And given it's a climate and environment conference, you would think that as Australia's leading environment organisation, we would be involved in some of these discussions. So we are very much having to make an impact by meeting people for coffee and networking on the outside.
I also think there's an impression that Australia's shooting itself in the foot. Even just to put climate change to one side for a second, these are technological shifts driven by emissions reductions that will be the jobs and economies of the future. And Australia's continuing to hitch its wagon of fossil fuels. I mean, Australia has made some decent technological related announcements backed up by announcements by mainly by state governments back in Australia, particularly on the eastern seaboard and South Australia. But there's a recognition that when the world's moving on climate, it's also moving to a new economy, and Australia can deal itself out of that global economy. And D-Day for Australia, making what choice does it want to make? What future economy does it want to have? Does it want the jobs and economies of the future or not? That's coming very rapidly because the world's moving now very quickly on everything from renewable energy to green steel and aluminium to the take-up of electric vehicles and so forth. So, as I said, Australia has made some okay announcements on that front, but it's hard to see them really cut through without the clear targets and policies that industry in Australia is crying out for to drive that transition back at home.
And I would say as well, I'm hearing a lot just from everyday people in Glasgow when I've asked them what do they think about Australia. They said, didn't you just have really bad bushfires? I've heard the bushfires come up so much. And I'm like, yeah, we did. We had the most catastrophic bushfire season, 2019, 2020. And people are finding it really hard to fathom after that huge disaster why Australia still doesn't have ambitious climate policy. It's a really strange one for people to wrap their heads around. I spoke to some folk from Nigeria yesterday, and I put the question to them, do you think Australia could be doing more? Of course. Countries like Nigeria would love to see some more finance to help transition their country and help mitigate the disasters already there in Nigeria. So there are certainly, I'm not hearing anything positive about Australia on the global stage. Apart from the fact when they meet people from ACF and the Climate Council and the bushfire survivors for climate action, there are a few of us here, and we're certainly trying to get the message out there that actually a majority of Australians want to see stronger climate action this decade.
Right, you mentioned that a lot of the questions and feedback you're getting from people from outside of Australia at Glasgow there is about the bushfire season we had a few years ago being quite catastrophic, and therefore our lack of action on climate change. Christine Jonathan has asked or has said that she's interested to see that there is that representation from smaller island nations such as the Marshall Islands. And she wonders if there's any hope or help that has come out of this particular conference for these smaller countries which are already badly suffering from climate change and its increasingly hazardous effects.
I think we were, so the Pacific Island, one of the unfortunate outcomes from COVID is that it's been very difficult for some of those representatives from poor countries to get here and have their voice heard. But Pacific Island nations punch well above their weight in these negotiations and will again in the next week. There will be substantial climate finance announcements made in the next week or so, and already we have had some substantial announcements. Canada made a big announcement, Japan, and so as I said, that's climate finance both to help those countries develop in a way that keeps their emissions down, and then secondly helps fund them to deal with the impacts of climate disasters that these nations are actually on the front line of. So I think they will get some substantial financial assistance in new announcements in the next week or so. But as I said, there's no replacement for emissions reduction. Money can only buy you so much. It doesn't stop the country going underwater, right? So we really need to see stronger emissions reduction pledges. But I think those countries will get some significant financial pledges hitting their way in the next few days.
And we just mentioned Canada. There was a gentleman from Canada sitting just opposite us who was there tapping on his laptop. And when we mentioned him, he gave us a big smile and thumbs up. So, you know, Canada's pretty, to give you an idea, we're in a space that there are literally hundreds of people doing things like this, actually. There's a lot of live crosses going on. There's also the bigger media around. I've lost my train of thought. So I'll throw back to you, Maddie.
That's okay. Jacqueline's got a question, and you've sort of also touched a little bit on it already in an Australian context, Freya. But Jacqueline's question is, which countries, NGOs or activists are doing well at COP? So if we've got leadership...
Sorry, yeah, that's what I was getting to. Sorry, thanks, Jacqueline, for the timely question. So in terms of Australian ENGOs, there are, as I mentioned, there's the 1 Million Women have a rep here, the bushfire survivors for climate action. Jo Dodds is making a fairly big splash here, I would say, in terms of what she wants to get out of this. She's really making her point at the Australian Pavilion that it's not good enough to have a Santos model on display. In terms of outside of this is the blue zone, isn't it? The blue zone is where a lot of the negotiations take place. Over at the green zone, there are so many young activists. I would say I haven't seen a lot of young activists in this space. So they're all over at the green zone making their point there. People may have seen Greta Thunberg and her crew making a splash there outside, because I think they are feeling very much that they're sick of the talk that goes on. And although this is hugely important, and we've spoken a little bit about the momentum that's here, there are certainly a lot of protests going on outside of the building by smaller activist groups who are just doing everything they can. They feel so passionately about it, doing everything they can to have a presence and have a presence here at COP26.
And all the just so you know, all the big climate groups from around the world, NGOs, form an alliance called the Climate Action Network International. We meet at 9 o'clock every morning. I'm skipping today's meeting. And we develop sort of strategy for the day. And that's literally hundreds of NGOs having an impact, pressuring their government, pressuring each other's governments to lift their game, sharing intel, sharing information so that we can strengthen the text of these negotiations as strong as possible. I think if there's one slight disappointment on the downside, it's the lack of Indigenous access to this COP. They've largely been shut out again, and that's despite Indigenous First Nations people from around the world being the most impacted by climate change and also having a lot of the answers. It's the wisdom and leadership of Indigenous First Nations people that we need to see at the front of these negotiations, not shut out. So I think the NGO sector also needs to do a lot more to amplify Indigenous voices.
But also the government does. You know, for all of Brazil's faults, I have heard that the Brazil government paid for a contingent of Indigenous First Nations people to come over to Glasgow. As much as it's on the NGOs to lift that voice, it's also on the government to make sure that our Indigenous people, our First Nations people, are at the table on this. And I think it's a real shame. And there are only 4 Indigenous people here out of the entire Australian delegation and contingencies. So, yeah.
Can you give us a bit of a sense to that point then? I mean, there are images and footage coming out of Indigenous peoples from around the world, how that actually compares to other nations and representations of First Nations people from other countries and other nations around the world?
Australia's Indigenous reputation, that's a Freudian slip. Representation is traditionally very low. I mean, compared to even the Maori delegation from New Zealand, Pacific Island First Nations from South America and Africa, Australian Aboriginal voices at COPs is traditionally embarrassingly low, and more needs to be done by the Australian government and by the NGO sector to increase Indigenous representation. Because as I said, that's not tokenistic. Indigenous First Nations people have many of the answers to the climate crisis and need to be at the table to provide that leadership about how they've cared for country, how they've looked after the earth and each other for thousands and thousands of years. And they need to, their voices, as I said, need to be amplified. They need a seat at the table at these negotiations.
We'll start wrapping up, I think, shortly, folks. But if you do have any last questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat because we want Gav and Freya to be able to get on with their day. It is only about 9:34 in the morning, and I'm sure it's quite cool in a Scotland a Scottish November over there. Ari Maggs has asked, is the Australian government or its delegates currently promoting the new draft blue carbon ERF methods? And maybe if you could also explain for those who might not be familiar with what the ERF is in this live session, Gav and Freya, are you able to give an insight into what's happened at that sort of ministerial level with Angus Taylor making his announcement the other day?
Suzanne, do you want to quickly do an explainer on the ERF?
Yeah, I was about to handball it to Suzanne too.
Do it, but you'll do better than me.
Sure. So the ERF is Australia's emissions reduction fund, and it basically uses what we call reverse auction. So folks that have projects that reduce emissions can create credits and bid into that fund, and the lowest bidder gets the project. But there are different ways that you can bid in. And the government has created what they call different methods under that fund. And so if you're in agriculture, for example, you might be able to bid in under a fund that has to do with land care. In this case, the government has recently announced a new method to be able to sell credits, and you get obviously money per credit for that, based on blue carbon. One of the areas the Australian government has actually been doing okay on, I have to admit this, is with blue carbon. So that is the preservation and protection of mangroves and seagrasses, which are very, very, very capable of storing carbon. So they have just launched this new method, and I'm sure Angus Taylor was working it in Glasgow, and that does provide an opportunity for folks to create projects around that sort of protection.
Thanks, Suzanne. Gav, I might throw back to you and Freya over there in Glasgow. Are you able to just give us a bit of an insight into what was announced by the Climate Change and Energy Minister the other day, for those that might not be aware of it, and how that probably reflects in terms of an actual ability to positively influence Australia's carbon emissions reduction?
To say I'm not across that announcement in detail. I mean, I agree with Suzanne. Australia's performance on blue carbon at the last couple of COPs actually has been pretty good. And I think that's in recognition of Australia's immense natural biodiversity, huge natural and cultural values on our coastlines, our mangrove systems, clearly, the Great Barrier Reef, the kelp forests in Tasmania. It has been an area where Australia has led, but in terms of the specifics of Taylor's announcement yesterday, I'll get back to people before our next Facebook Live.
The last question that we've got sitting here is probably a very broad question, which Suzanne, Gav, or Freya. Freya, you are the Media and Investigations Manager, so you might actually be best placed to kick this off. It's a question about transparency in media and the influence of key media stakeholders and media monopolies in Australia and the way that they talk about government action and policy, and the role that that needs to start playing in order to have a positive climate outcome for Australia. What would you say needs to be done from that perspective to help move the dial towards more positive conversations in the public sphere?
Well, it's a great question. Whoever sent that in, thank you. It's something that I'm really passionate about. We've all seen the press gallery here fly in and focus primarily on Macron and Morrison's relationship. But meanwhile, there's an entire global climate conference happening. So the Australian media and media in general has a huge role to play to achieve greater climate action, the way we communicate it. For the last decade, certainly, that I had been in journalism, there was earlier on a hesitancy to even link some natural disasters in Australia to climate change. We still really need to, the Australian media needs to communicate that stronger and communicate the science. And what we all would like to see is the politics come out of it, and for this to be a purely environmental story, because we've got the Prime Minister of Australia standing up on a global stage boasting about 35% emissions reduction by 2030, but we all know that 35% by 2030 isn't enough for climate and nature. So in terms of what the media could do more, they could take the politics out of the story. They could start talking to experts in climate and nature and environment NGOs, people who dedicate their life and career to this area. I hope that helps to answer the question, but it's certainly something that, and I hope, Facebook Lives like this and the content that we're producing from the media and investigations team at ACF helps to inform the wider public. We have an absolute kick-ass investigations team who are putting in FOIs, Freedom of Information requests, every week to hold this government to account. So that's really important as well, to have that kind of team here to feed that information to journalists and get the story out there.
I'll finish up by plugging those particular FOI inquiries. There were some recent releases put out about that. So if you are interested in seeing the sluggish nature of Australia's FOI system, jump on the ACF website at acf.org.au. Jump on the news page and you'll be able to find that detail there. Suzanne, Freya and Gav, thanks so much for joining us this evening, Australia time, this morning, Glasgow time. And we look forward to catching up with you again as the next phase of COP rolls on in a couple of days. And thanks to everyone in our audience tonight for asking your questions and tuning in. Really appreciate it. And great to have so much interest and passion for this really important climate conference in Glasgow this week and next. Please keep an eye out and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thanks, Maddie, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks everyone for tuning in.
See ya.
Thanks everyone.